So for this video, I'm going to be discussing underrated female characters written by Stephen King. And if you're wondering why I'm doing underrated, last week's video I did the best female characters written by Stephen King, but there are still a bunch that I want to talk about that didn't quite make that list of my top 12, actually. So I think I've got like 10 or maybe 11 female Stephen King characters to talk about in this video that just missed the cut. And a lot of these I think were just really great female Stephen King characters, and they're very underrated in my mind. So I want to make this video to chat about them, and hopefully y'all agree. But definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with me, and still let me know what are your favorite Stephen King female characters and what are some underrated ones as well. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first off, I'm going to start off with a book that I'm not really a big fan of. In fact, I think this is Stephen King's most overrated book. If you guys have watched my videos for a while, you guys probably know what it is. But one of the female characters in here, I did really enjoy when I did read this book. I'm, of course, talking about The Stand, and I'm of course, talking about Franny Goldsmith. And she's definitely one of the highlights of this book. This book, like I said, it's overrated. I loved part one, and then part two and three, I did not like. I think the ending is bad. I think it's one of Stephen King's most over bloated books of all time. I know people love this book and they cite it as one of his best, if not his best book, which always boggles my mind. But one of the best parts of this book is Franny and her character and her story arc. I really did enjoy her character. And there, Stephen King in this book does have great characters. My main complaint is kind of the plot and the fact that for a long time it doesn't really go anywhere, and then the ending kind of sucks, in my opinion. But I will admit, Franny is probably one of the better parts of this book. Another one of my favorite female Stephen King characters that just missed the cut is Sarah from The Dead Zone. And if you guys haven't read this book, I won't spoil too much, but at the beginning of the book, you get the protagonist of Johnny Smith, and before he gets into his coma, where he learns, and then after he gets out of the coma, he kind of gains these powers, which I won't go into too much spoilers for that. But before any of that starts, like the first few chapters, Johnny Smith is a teacher. He's going on a date with another teacher at a school named Sarah. And she's just a really wonderful character. And then, after the coma, Sarah comes into play in the story. And I won't spoil it too much, but I do enjoy kind of her story arc and where she goes from there, and kind of their weird relationship that Johnny Smith has. She's just a really good character. And if you guys don't know, The Dead Zone is my favorite Stephen King book of all time. All the characters in here are really interesting, especially Johnny Smith. He's one of my favorite protagonists, but also Sarah in here, who, not a minor role, but not like a major role. She is still prevalent in this book, and she's one of the better female characters that Stephen King has ever written. Another character that just barely made my top 10, my top 12 favorite female characters is the mom from Cujo, Donna Trenton. She's really good in this story. If you don't know, Cujo is obviously about a rabid dog, and Donna is the mom that gets kind of locked in a car with her son Ted, and Cujo is trying to get after them. And basically the first half of this book is a lot of her kind of dealing with situational stuff before she even gets trapped in the situation that she's in. A lot of people don't love the first half of the book, but I love all of this book, and Donna is a major part of that book, or a major part of that first half of the book. And her character, she's definitely flawed. Like, she is a good mother, but also not really the best person. Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much, but her character is really good. And then just the way that she has to try to survive and save herself and her son from this dog, very compelling, especially in the second half of this book. Just barely missed. Like, it was either her or Rachel Creed. Looking back, she might have been a good spot on there just because I love her so much. But yeah, she's definitely one of the best. Next up, we have Leigh Cabot from Christine. And most of this novel is told from Arnie and Dennis's POV. Arnis is kind of like this nerd who gets hold of this old beat up car and just decides to buff up this car, and all of a sudden he kind of turns into this whole totally different person, maybe possessed in some way. And then you have Dennis, kind of the football jock who always gets the girl. Leigh Cabot in this book is the girl, but then, you know, I guess a minor spoiler, Arnie does end up with her. And she's an interesting character because she definitely by the end of this book gets mixed up in all of this craziness. If you don't know, Christine is basically about a possessed car that kills people. And she kind of gets in the middle of this, you know, by the end of the book. And she's just a really, I wouldn't say like upper echelon female character, but solidly well written and no real complaints with her. Definitely a great addition to this book. Next up, we have a character from one of the stories in Skeleton Crew, actually the first novella that's in here, called The Mist. And I'm, of course, talking about Mrs. Carmody, who is one of the best villains in Stephen King literature. If you don't know, The Mist is basically about the mist that rolls into this town and presumably the world. And there's kind of all of these weird Lovecraftian bug creatures out in the mist, so you don't really want to get caught into that. And it's really about these characters that get kind of locked up trying to be safe in this big old supermarket. And Mrs. Carmody is a character in there that's just this religious nut, and she's kind of, you know, trying to get people to join her, I guess. But yeah, she's really compelling. She's kind of a nutty character, but she's really compelling at the same time. So she's definitely one of the better villains that Stephen King has ever written. Not quite Annie Wilkes level, but still very good. Next up, we have Rose Matter. And shameless plug, this is actually one of the books we'll be reading for the Stephen King Book Club, run by me and Ian from Ian the Reader. This is actually our March pick. So if you want to either reread this book or read it for the first time in March, definitely check it out. Not one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, mind you, but one of the best parts about this book is the main character of Rose Daniels, and I did really enjoy the first half of this book. It's basically about this woman named Rose Daniels who's basically running away from her abusive cop husband and kind of flees the city and tries to make a new life. And you kind of get two perspectives of her running away and the cop husband, abusive prick, who is trying to look for her and find her. So very compelling from the start, and Rose Daniels is definitely one of the better Stephen King female characters. The problem is that, you know, when I do think about this book, I do think about kind of the direction it goes in, and I didn't really love it the first time that I read it. So with that in mind, it's kind of hard to equate her as being one of my favorites, even though, because it's not one of my favorite books. But hopefully when I go back and reread it, I will enjoy it more for what it is, and maybe she'll climb the ladder of favorite female Stephen characters for me. We'll see. We've also got Stephanie McCain. Does anyone out there know who that is besides me? I'll give y'all a few seconds to try to guess it. Don't Google it. Just try to see if you remember who that is. It's the female character from the Colorado Kid. And I wouldn't say she's like an all-time favorite for me, but she's kind of the compelling point that starts out this book, because if you don't know, Colorado Kid, super underrated Stephen King book. A lot of people hate it, but it's great. She is kind of like the young up-and-coming reporter that's trying to get her foot in the door, and she's kind of talking with these two guys, and she's getting them to talk about this unsolved case that happened in town. And basically the whole book is about this just unsolved case, and she's kind of the spark of this. And yeah, she is very well written. I wouldn't say she's kind of the main focus of the book, but very compelling, and I do really like her character. And super underrated book. Everyone should at least try it, even though a lot of people don't like it. Try it. I think we are reading this, in fact, for the Stephen King Book Club. I forget which month. It might be July. I think it's July. Yeah, it's July. So definitely check it out in July. If you haven't already, it's going to be a fun reread for me. And then we have another collection called Just After Sunset. And the second story in here is called The Gingerbread Girl. And the character I'm talking about in here is named Emily, and she has a rough time in this story. If you don't know, I believe I mentioned this in like some of my scariest Stephen King stories ever told, because Stephen King does really well at telling realistic horror. And in this one, you meet this girl named Emily, and at the start of the book, you realize that she's kind of lost her baby, and she's basically just running for her life to kind of distract herself from everything. She goes on very long runs every day. And then, you know, kind of not a minor spoiler, but this is a spoiler, so if you don't want to know this, skip this part. But she gets kidnapped. She gets captured by somebody, and very creepy, very disturbing. But yeah, her character, very compelling from the get-go. Like, you learn how rough her life is, and then she's kind of finally starting to turn things around, and then bam. But yeah, she, very compelling character, especially by the end, where you realize like just how far she has to go to get out of the situation. But yeah, Emily from The Gingerbread Girl in the collection Just After Sunset, very compelling. We also have the villain from one of my favorite Stephen King sequels of all time, which would be Rose the Hat from Doctor Sleep. Now, obviously, Rose the Hat, I won't say pales in comparison to Jack Torrance, but she's obviously not as iconic as Jack Torrance. But Rose the Hat is still definitely a very compelling villain in here. If you don't know, Doctor Sleep is the sequel to The Shining, takes place kind of years after the events of that. Danny Torrance is all grown up now, and he's got some new stuff to deal with, including Rose the Hat, which is kind of the leader of this group of people, beings, if you will. I won't go into too much detail about like what they do and like what they're all about, but she is very compelling, very creepy at times. But yeah, definitely very compelling. Rose the Hat from Doctor Sleep. Next up, we have a character that quite possibly could have made my top 10 list if it weren't for future installments in her story. I'm, of course, talking about Gwendy from kind of the Gwendy trilogy. This first one that I'm holding up is really good. Gwendy's Button Box, one of Stephen King's better novellas that he's written, and her character in this one, at least, very compelling, very good. The problem is, Gwendy's Magic Feather, which was not written by Stephen King, written by Richard Chizmar solely. That book was awful. I did not like that book, and that kind of ruined my enjoyment for this book, which is very unfortunate. And then we have Gwendy's Final Task, which is the third book in that trilogy. That book is also not very good, and also her character arc is just not good. So it kind of ruins my enjoyment, really, like those two, which I will never reread, by the way. But this one I will reread, and I do really enjoy her character in this one, but it also just leaves a sour taste in my mouth because I know where her story kind of ends up, which is not very good. So she would have been in my top 10 if it wasn't for those, but she's still definitely deserving as at least an underrated mention here. And then last up, I debated whether or not to put her on this list because I know a lot of people really don't like her character, but in my opinion, she's kind of become an underrated character for the amount of hate that she gets. I'm, of course, talking about Holly Gibney, and I'm going to hold up this one if it bleeds because I do believe Holly is at her best in this. She's in several Stephen King books, if you haven't known already. She's originally in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy. She's kind of more of a minor role, especially in that first book, and then she becomes more of a major role. And then she's also in The Outsider in the second half of that book, kind of a major point in that book in the second half. And then she gets her own novella in here, If It Bleeds, which I think she's really good in this novella. Like, if it would have just ended there, would have been perfect. But then, she gets her own novel, which may not have been the best idea. That book was not really well received, especially by me, but by a lot of people. And it's sad though, because it's not necessarily about her character. It's kind of the things that Stephen King decides to include in that book. But for me, Holly, she's definitely not one of the best Stephen King characters. She's definitely become a fan favorite over the years. And Stephen King himself definitely has a love for writing Holly. But I would say, especially in the last year or so, Holly, at least in this corner of BookTube, has become a topic of anger because people do not like her books. But I'm here to say that she does shine in some of her books, especially in If It Bleeds. Her novella in here, very good. And then she's also good in The Outsider. And then the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, she has some good moments. The Holly book was not good, I will admit that. But her character itself, I think, has become underrated in a sense. And I thought it was worth mentioning here. And if you disagree with me, leave it down in the comments below and we'll chat about it. All right, those are even more female Stephen King characters that I think are worth mentioning that are really good. That didn't quite make my best of list, my top 10 or 12, if you will, but I definitely think they're worth including here. I do think maybe now thinking about it, I would have switched out Rachel Creed for Donna Trenton because looking back now, she's definitely one of my favorites. And Rachel Creed, it's more of like, I wished we would have gotten more of her, but I think Donna, I think she was well deserved to be in that video. But oh well, I'm not redoing it, so it is what it is. But yeah, I'm not going to name all of them, but there's definitely some good female Stephen King characters in this group, in this video. Definitely let me know if you agree or disagree with any of my picks here. I want you to chat about it in the comments with me. And also just let me know if you have any ideas for future Stephen King content you'd like to see on here. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And the Bookastronomer Discord, if I can speak, where we're still running the Stephen King book club. We started out with different seasons, which has been going great. And then, like I mentioned, we're going to be doing a couple of the books I mentioned here, Rose Matter and The Colorado Kid. And I think Christine, too. We're doing that in October. No, September, if I can remember correctly. So, yeah, a lot of Stephen King books coming. I will be doing book reviews for all of the books we're doing for the book clubs, at least the ones that I haven't reviewed yet on the channel. I think maybe a couple of them I've done. But anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching. And Patreon page if you want to go support me there. Amazon wishlist if you want to buy me a book. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a fantastic day.